Later he knew that these elements of an unforgotten nightmare had been cued in by the aircraft emerging around him on all sides. Helen Winthrop's Cessna, the fortress he was exposing to light, the blackened Messerschmitt which the advertising man was lifting from the seabed. After a storm had disturbed the sandflats, he stood on the balcony of the beach house, inhaling the carbonated air, trying to free himself from the uneasy dreams that had filled the night, a system of demented metaphors. In front of him, the surface of the sandflats was covered with dozens of pieces of rusting wood. Aircraft parts showed in the roofs by the storm. As Helen Winthrop watched from the bedroom window, he stepped onto the beach and walked across the ruffled sand, counting the fragments of carburetor and exhaust manifold, trim tab and tail wheel that lay around him as if left here by the receding tide of his dreams. Already other memories were massing around him, fragments that he was certain belonged to another man's life, details from the case history of an imaginary patient whose role he had been tricked into playing. When Helen Winthrop left without him, Melville was surprised, but not disappointed. He was working up on the dunes as the heavily laden Cessna, fitted with the wing tanks he had installed, took off from the airstrip. He knew immediately from the pitch of the engine that this was not a trial flight. Sitting on the roof turret of the fortress, he watched her climb away across the sand flats, make a steady right-hand turn towards the sea, and set off downwind across the channel. Long before she was out of sight, Melville had forgotten her. He would make his own way to the Pacific. During the following weeks, he spent much of his time sheltering under the aircraft, watching the wind blow the sand back across the fuselage. With the departure of Helen Winthrop and the advertising executive of his Messerschmitt, he found that his dreams grew calmer, shutting away his memories of the space flights. At times he was certain that his entire memory of having trained as an astronaut was a fantasy, part of some complex delusional system, an extreme metaphor of his real ambition. This conviction brought about a marked improvement in his health and self-confidence. "I'm taking her, only the photographs. You won't need them once you get to Wake Island. Perhaps they're more real for me now than the island could ever be." When Helen Winthrop left without him, Melville was surprised, but not disappointed. He was working up on the dunes as the heavily laden Cessna, fitted with the wing tanks he had installed, took off from the airstrip. He knew immediately from the pitch of the engine that this was not a trial flight. Sitting on the roof turret of the fortress, he watched her climb away across the sand flats, make a steady right-hand turn towards the sea, and set off downwind across the channel. Long before she was out of sight, Melville had forgotten her. He would make his own way to the Pacific. During the following weeks, he spent much of his time sheltering under the aircraft, watching the wind blow the sand back across the fuselage. With the departure of Helen Winthrop and the advertising executive of his Messerschmitt, he found that his dreams grew calmer, shutting away his memories of his space flights. At times he was certain that his entire memory of having trained as an astronaut was a fantasy, part of some complex delusional system. Even when Dr. Lang climbed the dunes and told him that Helen Winthrop had died 2 weeks after crashing her Cessna at Nairobi airport, Melville had recovered sufficiently to feel several days of true grief. He drove to the airfield and wandered round the empty hangar, traces of her over-hurried departure. A suitcase of clothes and a spare set of rescue flares lay among the empty oil drums. Returning to the dunes, he continued to dig the crashed bomber from the sand, careful not to expose too much of it to the air. Although often exhausted in the damp winter air, he felt increasingly calm, sustained by the huge bulk of the fortress, whose cockpit he never entered, and by his dream of flying to Wake Island.
William Boyd reading J.G. Ballard's My Dream of Flying to Wake Island. William spoke to Lisa Allardyce of Guardian Review about his choice.
It's a typical Ballard. It's a revisiting of his usual obsessions, and I think Ballard actually is a revolutionary short story writer. You can put him, I think, up with Chekhov and Hemingway as somebody who completely changed the form. Nobody wrote short stories like Jim Ballard until he did, but maybe the one aspect of the revolution is not so good that nobody can ever write anything like him because it just looks like a pastiche or a copy. But this particular story, My Dream of Flying to Wake Island, is an abandoned resort on a beach, World War II bombers, strange, mentally damaged characters. All these tropes appear in Ballard's fiction again and again and again. And he seems to me almost to be kind of Philip Glass to the short story, if you know what I mean, that these repetitive structures that Philip Glass has in his music, it's sort of endless ostinatos of themes being repeated again. This is what Ballard does, and it's incredibly haunting, I think, and incredibly powerful. You can't really unlock the key to the baffling mysteries of the story. I mean, Ballard himself trained as a pilot, and I think this is why planes play such a large part in his fiction. And so they represent some vague idea of freedom, of release, of recovery. But it is a kind of haunting in a way, and I think that's what makes the stories so powerful. And they do form a body of work because
yes, the next one's called, I think it's sandwiched in the collection where one that is then the air disaster, low-flying aircraft, notes towards a mental breakdown.
Yes, I mean I'm taking this story from a volume called Memories of the Space Age. These are all random stories that all somehow to do with Cape Canaveral astronauts, damaged astronauts, abandoned resorts near launching sites, all these sort of surreal landscapes that Ballard invents and populates with this sort of strangely neutral characters. The women are all the same, the men are all the same, they're either advertising executives or doctors, so they're a very curious, unique type of story.
As Amos said, and he wrote a super tribute to Ballard when he died last year, and he said that there came a point where he turned from outer space to inner space. And in some ways, this story is a perfect example of that. It's a man who went to outer space and his own interior life fell apart. And now in the story, we don't know how much we're living in Paul Melville's obsessions, his fantasies, his dreams of flying.
Exactly, and the other extraordinary thing is that this fortress bomber is being unearthed on a beach on the Channel. You think you're in California or something like that. But that's, again, it's symptomatic of the way the Ballard landscape is, in a way, timeless and eerie and impossible to place geographically. He's very influenced by surreal painters. I think Max Ernst, Paul Delvaux, I think of Giorgio de Chirico, or even Edward Hopper. I keep getting these painterly images in my mind.
Of this windswept sort of this, he keeps walking across the beachfront on his balcony.
And the figures, as in an Edward Hopper painting, the figures are kind of emblematic rather than real.